Now, first of all, there are a couple of points that I want to bring out, and these points could not be brought out better than the way that they are brought out in this particular book. For any of you that are interested, this is an excellent book to read. It's called Death and the Art of Dying in Tibetan Buddhism by Bokhara Rinpoche. The reason why I especially like this is that it's actually not taken from any one text. It is taken by a grouping of teachings that this Lama gave in a very conversational way. And like I've told you, I think that Westerners really understand conversational teachings better. That's my perception anyway. I do feel that that happens. And so he gives these teachings in a very conversational way, and he gives them often in question and answer form, and that seems to be very useful for students. It's very approachable, and it's very clear the way that he gives these teachings. So I would like to use a little bit of the way that he approaches some ideas so that you can get them a little bit better. Now, we have talked about the six realms of cyclic existence. Now we are going to be talking about the 6 Bardos. You should understand, first of all, that what is Bardo? We think, the way that we think of the different kinds of Bardo. We think about, for instance, we start with the Bardo of Living, and so the Bardo of Living starts at the time of birth and ends with the time of death, or just before the time of death. And that we think of as the Bardo of Living. So the way that our minds think, we think, let's see, October 12th, 1949, that's when my Bardo of Living started, and when's it going to end? We don't know that yet. So I have a date here, and someday we'll have a date here. You see? And that's what we think. We think Bardo goes from October 12th, 1949 to whenever that is. Now, another Lama would laugh with me as to how silly it is to think that way. But since we, as sentient beings, don't have that kind of teaching, we don't know how funny that is, but that's pretty funny. Because it's a very confused and superficial and erroneous way to think of the Bardo. The Bardo is not actually a period of time that starts with this and ends with that. The Bardo is passage. It is passage. And it is the way that passage appears to us. Bardo is a way of describing movement or passage. It is a way of displaying display, in a sense, or a way of seeing the display of display. Generally, it is said that there are many different kinds of Bardos because there are as many Bardos as there are individual experiences. If you think about it, you could literally sit down to a meal and call that the Bardo of dining. Absolutely, there would be nothing wrong with doing that. That is the Bardo of dining. It does have a beginning moment, and there are causes and results within the Bardo of dining. What you eat will affect your body. You know, what is that, an instant on the lips, forever on the hips? That kind of thing. So there is a cause and result even within that small Bardo, but that's a Bardo. The Bardo of sitting in class. The Bardo of entering into class, you incur causes and results while in class due to the force of your listening, how you listen, what you think when you listen, what your intentions are. You are creating cause and effect relationships that begin and end within a certain passage. That is a Bardo. But generally, in the general sense, it is said that there are 6 Bardos. There is the Bardo of Living, which is the Bardo of birth to death, which according to, and again there are many different ways to describe that, but this Rinpoche says, the Bardo of birth to death, which ceases as soon as the first signs of the agony of death start. And I have also heard that once one knows that one is dying, or one experiences, once one catches the disease that will ultimately cause the death, then you are in a different Bardo, actually, than the Bardo of Living, although technically it still is part of the Bardo of Living. It is called the Bardo of Preparation, or the Bardo of the Bardo of, there are many different ways. Bardo of the preparation for death, the Bardo before death. There is a passage time that precedes the time of death. Once you have caught or have experienced the problem that will end your life. That is another way to describe it. But this Lama says when the first signs of the agony of death start. Then there is the Bardo of the dream state, which is delineated by the moment we fall asleep and the moment we wake up. So each time we sleep and dream, that is a bardo. And there is a beginning and an end. There is a passage within that, and there are cause and effect relationships that are begun and also ripen within that bardo. There is the bardo of meditative concentration. I've also heard it called the bardo of meditation and the bardo of concentration. And that lasts from the beginning to the end of a meditation or concentration. Meditation, according to, that is meditation in Dharma, or concentration such as vipassana practice or shamatha practice, that sort of practice, simply silent meditation. This kind of practice is so profoundly different from our normal waking consciousness that it deserves its own name. It is a different passage. It has a beginning time and an end time. It has its own causes and results that occur within the context of that passage according to how one conducts oneself during that passage. How you meditate. Do you meditate really putting yourself into it? Do you meditate in a haphazard way? These kinds of things. So that is a bardo. There is the bardo of the moment of death, which commences, and here he says, which commences when the death process begins and which lasts until actual death. And there it's more clear, because in truth, if you have already caught the disease that will ultimately cause your death, then in that case, you have already literally begun the process of death. And another way to look at it is the moment you stop growing. Once you start aging, you have also begun the process of death, you see? That's true. Once the body stops growing and begins to go on the downside of that, which mine definitely has started to do, I can tell. There is another bardo involved in that, and that is a bardo that is, while technically still part of the bardo of living, it is the bardo of the moment of death as well. It is a contributing factor to that. But more succinctly and more clearly, it is generally said that the bardo of the moment of death begins when the death process has actually begun. There is the bardo of dharmata, which starts when death occurs and lasts until the deities appear in the post-mortem state. That will be explained in detail later on. We will talk about the moment of the perception of the white luminosity, the moment of the perception of the red luminosity, the moment of the perception of the clear or black luminosity. And the bardo of dharmata that we are talking about here actually begins during the moment of the recognition or the perception or the appearance of the black or clear luminosity. That is when the external breath has ceased and the internal wind has just begun to cease, is just now ceasing. Then at that moment, that is the bardo of dharmata. The elements have already begun to dissolve. In some cases they are dissolved, and in other cases they are continuing to dissolve, but they are at that critical point where there is a final dissolution. And at that point one will see the nature of the dharmata. However, an inexperienced practitioner will not recognize it, and they will go through what in death is thought of as a fainting period or a dark period that everyone who dies who has not experienced a meditation will experience, because they do not recognize the face of the dharmata or that light which is clear but may appear as black. So this particular passage, the bardo of dharmata then starts when the outer breath has ceased. The inner wind still continues to some degree. From that point on until the moment when the deities appear, and we will talk about when the deities appear. And then, after the bardo of dharmata, and this is considering that one has not liberated oneself up until this point from the bardo. The next stage in the bardo is the bardo, or rather the next bardo, is the bardo of becoming, which starts when the previous bardo ceases, and that's the bardo that ceases when the deities appear. and ends when we are born. Now, the Bardo of Becoming is absolutely indicates that you will once again, once you have reached the Bardo of Becoming, you will be reborn in cyclic existence. There's no help for it. You will be reborn in cyclic existence. But even during that time, you can create the causes of liberation that will cause you to be reborn in a way differently than what you are now. A more realized, more enlightened way, and particularly it is possible during the Bardo of Becoming to absolutely ensure that your next life will be associated with Dharma, will lead directly toward liberation, and will be correct in bringing you to the path, and without flaw in that regard. And so these are generally the 6 Bardos, but remember that Bardo, there's not only 6, there can be, depending on how you view things, uncountable Bardos, because Bardos are passages. And it is the delusion that we are passing through something that makes the Bardo seem like a limited space and a limited time. But in fact, it is simply movement and display. Let's see, the Lama here puts it in this way. The essence of the mind of all beings is called the essence of awakening. From this point of view, that which is that of ultimate truth, there is no Bardo. We know nothing of the ultimate nature of the mind, and that is why all sorts of illusory manifestations occur in the relative mode. Among these, there are the 6 Bardos that cause much suffering. Buddhist teachings intend to dispel such erroneous experiences and their resultant sufferings. So what we are looking at here is that while from the relative point of view and in the deluded state, this is what appears and this is what we must deal with, in the same way that you're here, you're alive, and you have to cope with that. In the same way, these are the experiences, these are what we have to deal with. Yet from the point of view of realization, there is no such thing, because there is no subjective and objective. It is only our delusion that causes us to see in this way. And so, characteristic of having that delusion and being trapped in that delusion, we actually have to study the delusion and learn about the delusion so that we can negotiate through the delusion into awakening. And that is how we have to view these time periods, these Bardo movements. He says also, and I think this is an important point to bring out, the 6 Bardos are not 6 domains existing independently within ourselves. And that, of course, that is how we think, isn't it? When will I get to that Bardo over there? That's how we think, because of our delusion. They are related to our mind, which lives in a state of delusion at this point. And he doesn't say at this point, I'm adding that. The 6 Bardos manifest out of our mind. It is our mind that has the experience, and it is our mind that recognizes their false nature. And eventually, it will be our mind that liberates us from the very products of the mind. So that is an interesting point to look at too. He gives a wonderful example, and this is another reading that I would like to give you, and that is the way that we experience the 6 Bardos and how it is uniquely different for each of us. How many different ways do you experience life? Is your life like his? Like his? Is your life like hers? How many different lives do we have in this room? As many as there are different people, right? Literally, and I know this for a fact, people can live in the same house, in the same room, even in the same bed, and they will have completely different experiences. It happens. It absolutely happens. And it's because of this. Now listen to how this Lama explains this. I think this is excellent. Likewise, the experience of death will be different for each one of you, although there are certain fundamental rules. Consider a house of rooms in which each wall is covered with mirrors. The man living in this house is dirty, has untidy hair, wears ragged clothing, and is always making faces. He goes from room to room, and the mirrors steadily reflect the same image of an unkept man with a grimacing face, untidy hair, and ragged clothing. Similarly, when our mind is distorted by a lot of negative karma, each of the six Bardos reflects suffering, just like the mirrored rooms in that house. And they have a footnote here about negative karma. Negative karma. All negative deeds, ones that deliberately make other people suffer, leave an imprint in our mind that will condition our experience and our vision of the world. And that is our suffering. That is what our suffering is. That is the content of our suffering. That is our only suffering. That is the only suffering we will ever experience. But it's enough. The house occupant could also be clean, well-dressed, and smiling. Everywhere he goes from room to room, he sees a clear and smiling face. The house remains the same, you see. But there is no more ugliness nor appalling sights. Everything is seen as pleasant and peaceful. When our mind is free of negative karma and the passions that disturb it, the six Bardos reflect a picture that resembles us, full of peace and happiness. Whether pleasant or not, experiences do not depend on the 6 rooms. An individual fills the rooms with his or her own nature. Likewise, negative experiences of the 6 Bardos do not depend on the Bardos, but they do depend on our own mind. Now, boys and girls, this is a very important point. It's important because you are living the result of that right now. You are passing right now through the Bardo of Living. The experience that you have depends on and is resulting from the habitual tendency within your mind, the karma of your own mind, the causality that you have already brought into play. The experience of your present-day life is due to that. All of the suffering that you will ever experience during the course of your life and all of the happiness is due to that, including the cause of your death, is due to the habitual tendency of your mind and the karmic patterns of your mind. Literally, think about it this way. If your experience was that of the kind of person who is really only here to see what they can get, and upon meeting other people only sees a potential source of satisfaction, and how many of us are in samsara are like that? Here is a potential source of satisfaction, and we see people and we wheedle and we whine and we feel sorry for ourselves and please love me and do this for me. Or we do the opposite, which is manipulative. We try to manipulate people into a position where they have nothing else to do but benefit us, you know? And we're real good at it. In fact, so good we hardly see it ourselves, but that's what we do. And then we have the other kinds of situations where we spend all of our lives trying to dominate the people in our environment and our environment, trying to force it to be what we want so that we can have what we want. The experience of the life passage or the Bardo of Living for a person like that, or persons like that, will be very different from the experience of a person that goes through life saying, how can I help? How can I contribute more love to the world? The kind of person that goes through life knowing that it matters much less how much love they get than it matters how much love they give will have a very different experience from the other kind of person. And that's what this Lama is talking about there. Not only during life, but also during death. Our death depends on the habit of our lives. If we are neurotic and frightened and whiny and complaining and weepy and emotional during the course of our lives, think, what will your death be like? What has your life been like? Think, this isn't a great mystery. I mean, you have this, everybody has this fantasy of climbing the Himalayas to get to the dirty guy on a rug up at top who knows everything, and he's going to tell you the secret of life. This is the secret of life. Think. Think about this. If this is your passage through life, what will your passage through death be? You've got to fix it now. On the other hand, if you are the other kind of person, if you have been a contributor, if you have been strong, if you have been loving, if you've tried to do your best, if you tried to contribute love to the world, if you have tried to practice, if you have tried to calm your mind, if you have tried to make your mind an attractive and virtuous vessel, your death experience is going to be quite different. Absolutely different. And so while there are individual experiences in the Bardo of dying. Let's talk about the general ones so that we can prepare. Now, since we are talking about the 6 Bardos, or Bardos in general, we want to be very clear on the Bardo of the moment of death. And that's the last subject that we will cover today, but it is a very, very important one, because we are all, in our way, preparing for death, and we will all definitely experience death. So, first of all, the Bardo of the moment of death. Again, we have talked about the point preceding death. And preceding death, there is a period of time during which, and a person may know or may not know, one has met with the condition that will bring about the death. Now, for those people who have a disease, a heart disease, or AIDS, or some disease like that, that is degenerative or progressive in some way, the moment that occurred to them, that was the moment that they entered into another Bardo, although it is still contained within the Bardo of Living. It is the Bardo that precedes death. What we're talking about now is the actual Bardo of the moment of death. That is when death is marked, it can be seen from the outside, and it actually occurs. Now, people will say, before I begin, I want to make something very clear. You know, we have funny ideas about death. We have some terrible ideas about death. First of all, we're scared to death of death. That's the truth. Which is funny, I guess, but I didn't really mean to make a pun. It sort of happened that way. But we are scared of death. We are terrified of death. And it's because we are unprepared. That's the only reason to be afraid of death. And preparation, as it happens, will dispel the fears of death. And I really think that even during this week, some of your fears of death may be dispelled because you will be better prepared. But in truth, until that time, we are terrified of death, and that is the main feeling that we have about it. We do not understand death, and we think that death is kind of like, it is a horrible, sort of killing thing that we have to go through, and that the best way to go through it is unconscious. This is the kind of idea that we have. People often will actually pray, "Let me die in my sleep. Let me die unknowing that I'm going through the death experience." And there are other people that say, "Let me die quickly." Well, for my money, I would like to be one of the fortunate ones who know for some period of time before their death that they have caught the cause of their death, or that they have the cause of their death. For my money, that's what I wish would happen to me if I were an ordinary sentient being. And if I were in that position, if I were in that position where I were caught in samsara, and we all feel that way, we all are, I would wish to have preparation time. I would wish to know beforehand. Those of us that are aging gradually and staying clear and in good health through the aging process, we are fortunate because our minds are clear, and yet we can clearly see in the mirror that we are approaching this time. Clearly, we are not the same person we were 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. Clearly, that is true. We remember, we have pictures to prove it. These people are fortunate. We are fortunate. Because seeing the evidence of death approaching, we have time to prepare. Yes, we have to experience the discomfort of knowing that death is approaching. But it's like going into the room, turning on the light, and seeing exactly where the stuff is so you can get around it. Remember, we used that analogy early today of walking through a room with all kinds of furniture. You want to do it when the light is on. You want to know how not to stumble. So this is what we're experiencing if we can prepare for our death. Particularly, I think about the tremendous suffering of diseases like AIDS. We talk about the tremendous suffering of something like that, and the fact that, and the biggest and most horrible part of it is that we die younger than we would have died if we did not have the disease. And that's how we think about it. And yet, a disease like that gives us the opportunity, in a way, it is half of a blessing. In a way, it is the quintessential suffering of cyclic existence. Couldn't be worse. It is, in a nutshell, what cyclic existence actually is when you take away the barbiturate effect that it has on us. Yet, in another way, it is a way to understand, you understand clearly as never before that death is imminent. There is a way to understand that you could not have had any other way. And it gives us extraordinary time. It gives us an extraordinary clarity of time to be able to practice. Because we're motivated. I mean, it's just that clear. We are motivated. We know we have a date to keep. And those of us that don't know what that date is, we're a little bit more vague about this. And we don't want to be bothered, frankly. And so we are at a disadvantage. Less lucky is the stuff that most people pray for. A quick death. Instantaneous. Hit me with a truck. You know, that kind of thing. That's how people think. Get it over with. Get me out of here. And it's because they don't understand what death is. They do not understand that once the eyes are closed and the breath is stopped. I mean, it sounds like a pun, but basically life goes on. In one form or another. One continues to continue. That is the nature of what we are. And so, there is no true cessation other than the cessation of breath. To die a quick death, I mean, it may save a little bit of discomfort for the unprepared, but it gives us no time for preparation. And even the dissolution of the elements must occur in an untimely and hurried way so that we cannot cope with them well. So do not pray for an instant death. Neither should you pray to die in your sleep, because it's too confusing. You are already in the sleeping Bardo. The sleeping Bardo has a heavier level of delusion in a way than the waking Bardo, because you're not slowed down by the time it takes physicality to process itself. For instance, if I want to walk from here to that door, it's going to take me a certain amount of time and effort because of the physicality of the situation. But in the dream, I'm there. I'm out, I'm gone, I can go anywhere. So in a way, there is even more delusion there. You do not want to die in the middle of the dream state unless your practice is so good that you would recognize the Bardo even in the dream state. And that can only be hoped for if you are the kind of person that has complete control and direction over your dreams. Always. And that ain't you. So, instead, pray for a time of knowing and a time of preparation. Pray for the leisure to prepare for your death. That is the appropriate and best prayer. Now, let's look at the Bardo of the moment of death. Our body is made up of 4 elements, and these are the elements. They are the earth element, the water element, the fire element, and the air element. At the moment of death, and what death actually is from a metaphysical point of view, these elements begin to disengage. Here they are knit. You see, they are knit into a fabric. They are knit into what you think of as yourself. You see? I will explain. The flesh, the bones, and the solid constituents belong to the earth element. They are considered the manifestations of the earth element. And you can see that these are part of your body system. Blood, phlegm, which we have more of in the winter times, isn't it true? Blood, phlegm, and bodily fluids belong to the water element, and you know you have those, especially in the morning. Body temperature, metabolism, the raising of your body temperature to be warm, belongs to the fire element, and you know that that is within your body. You can tell that you are warm. And respiration belongs to the air element. And what happens at the time of the death is that these elements begin to dissolve in their interconnectedness. And they dissolve into their natural state. And their natural state, of course, separate and apart from our deluded perception, is the same as one's own nature. It is the Buddha. In their natural state, they are none other than the Buddha. Yet we experience them as fire, earth, air, water, and we are even taught in our practice to recognize them because they will appear, even in the Bardo state, disguised as the goddesses of fire, earth, air, and water, and we still won't recognize them. We don't recognize anything in the Bardo state unless we prepare for it and think ahead. But in fact, in their very nature, although we are afraid of them and afraid of the very feelings that we are feeling, when these elements begin to dissolve, still in all, these are also the Buddha. And even recognizing these elements in their nature is one step toward the path of liberation. So do not be afraid. At the moment of death, the elements are absorbed into each other, and it gives rise to a twin series of phenomena, both internal and external. Now I will explain according. I love the way this Lama has put this, and so I'm going to utilize this, and then I will elaborate. These are the conditions that indicate the actual moment of death, the passing into the Bardo of death. First, the earth element is absorbed into the water element. How that is experienced externally is that the limbs can no longer be moved, and how that is experienced internally is that the mind begins to see things like mirages. That is the earth element absorbing into the water element. Then the next stage is that the water element is then absorbed into the fire element. Externally, that experience will be of the mouth and the tongue becoming quite dry. I must be dying because I'm dry over here. It's one of the signs. My limbs are moving though. I'm really glad about that. So externally, the mouth and tongue becomes dry, and internally, we perceive smoke that passes us or rises up before us. Now those, you should take note of this. These are the experiences that you must rehearse seeing, because you will see them. Know them, rehearse them, prepare for them, expect them, and recognize them in their nature when you do. Do not be afraid. There is nothing to fear. So we perceive smoke that passes us or rises up. Next, the fire element is absorbed into the air element. Externally, heat leaves the limbs, moving from the extremities toward the center of the body. This is seen in a hospital environment. When people die, they do actually have that progressive coolness that comes from the extremities into the center of the body. Internally, we will be seeing an array of sparks. Okay, an array of sparks. And then finally, the air element is absorbed into the individual consciousness. And here we are, there's a footnote here, and I'll sum it up. Here, when he says consciousness, he wants us to know that he's referring to the consciousness that operates in a dual mode, grasping an object that is separated from a subject, that kind of mind of duality. So he's talking about consciousness in the familiar way that we use it now. So finally, the air element is absorbed into the individual consciousness. Externally, the external breath actually ceases. Internally, what we will see is something like the flames of flickering butter lamps. Flickers. And that will be the air element actually absorbing into our own consciousness. Now, here are some additional bits of information that I would like to add as a way of recognition. Here are some other signs that actually occur. And this is a sign associated with the earth element. The first dissolution, which is the earth element absorbing into the water element. And I remember we have been taught that during this first wave of dissolution of the elements, one of the experiences that we will feel, and we will all feel this, is the feeling of falling or lack of safety. There is a feeling of falling. It depends on how the person is. If a person is semi-conscious and or unconscious, they may actually feel themselves falling down a tube, or even falling across a tube. But there is a feeling of falling. For many people, and I would say the majority of people will feel this way, there's actually a feeling of the body falling and not being safe. You can help a person who is dying by placing pillows around them to make them feel as safe as possible and creating a nest, a womb-like nest, even under the knees, even under the armpits, even under the arms, around the body, so that until the very last moment of their perceptual capacity, they will still be able to feel nested as though they are safe. And then when the other feelings are obviously beginning to occur, you can begin to explain to the person, you can say things like soothingly, pay no attention to the feeling of falling. You are safe. You are not falling. You are with me. That kind of thing. You can talk, and it will help them. And plus, the person who has had time to prepare will recognize the feel of falling and will be able to interpret it differently as perhaps a feeling of going, which does not have to have the fear of falling associated with it. And you wonder if that feeling is actually going to come to you. Okay, have you ever fallen asleep and jumped? It's the very same thing. There is a subtle dissolution of the elements as one enters into the dream bardo. That is similar to the death, but not as gross and heavy and final. So that feeling of falling. And sometimes the person that is dying will do that a little bit. And so that's how you can tell that that is actually occurring. When they talk about the mouth and tongue becoming dry, I've also heard that sometimes the person right before death will actually void what is in their body, or right at the time of death will actually void what's in their body. And that is also an indication that this has begun to take place, that the water element is now absorbing into the fire element. And so we will see signs like that. And the person, here, even in enlightened death, we're talking about Kala Rinpoche's death, he needed to get, he wished, he had the intention and the feeling to get up and void himself and prepare himself in that way. But that is an indication that the elements are already beginning to dissolve. And of course, the feeling of cold, the feeling of the heat leaving the limbs, it is absolutely beneficial to the person as they are dying, that you do keep them as warm as possible, because their comfort during that transition time is very important. It will influence the way their mind accepts the experience. So keep them warm to the best of your ability. If before the death cycle actually occurs, you could do something like what they would do in the old days, put a warm brick at their feet, put something warm at their hands, comforting. This is the time when you want to help the person keep their minds as comforted and relaxed as possible. So you do everything you can to help those feelings not to be so scary. And these are things that you can tell the ones around you to help you prepare for death, should you be the one experiencing this transition. And then finally, the air element is absorbed into the individual consciousness, as we spoke of, and that's when the breathing stops. Now, when the external breathing stops, that does not mean that death has actually occurred, even though medically, that's what they look for. They look for the breath, the cessation of the breath. There's actually a period of time during which, again, depending on the practice or the understanding or the inclination or the habitual tendency of each individual person, experience continues. When the outer breath stops, already visions have begun to arise, already images have begun to happen. There are lights, there are colors, there are things that are occurring that are unusual. There are visual things that are coming up. But the time in which we are actually considered dead, really dead, is after the external breath has stopped. And the other period of time that is a very essential and crucial period of time also passes. And that is the time between the stopping of the outer breath and the stopping of the inner winds. We have within us the air element. Its most gross display is our breath. Yet there's more to it than that, because within us are psychic winds and channels that are not seeable by fleshy eyes, yet they still exist. And these psychic winds and channels actually have much to do with the condition of our minds. That is to say, if our minds are disturbed and neurotic and needy and always upset, that kind of mind, the winds that move within the psychic channels of that mind will be erratic, like rather than kind of like that. They will be erratic. The wind channels, the channels within, will be soiled and dirty and sometimes misshapen and kinked. And so the inner experience then will be different for that kind of person than it is for a person that, say, has practiced and has kept their minds very calm and happy. The calmer and happy mind will have the inner winds moving through the psychic channels more calmly and serenely. And then when they stop, it will be a more calm and serene kind of experience. And also that small moment of experience when only the inner winds are still operational and the outer breath has already ceased will be much different as well. That inner experience will be much different as well. So by all means, do not think that it's goofy to try to keep yourself up and happy and peaceful and in a good mood. That's not goofy, that's great. That's what you should do. It really is beneficial to you, and it really produces health. And you will live longer. You will definitely live longer if you can keep yourself up and happy and in good humor, peaceful in your mind. You will live longer. So, at the end, there is this period of time between when the outer winds and when the outer breath occurs, stops, and the inner winds also cease. That, for the practitioner, is the most important period of time. The practitioner who has practiced Phowa will be very busy right then. The person who is helping the dying one through that particular period must know this, that once the outer breath has ceased, do not touch the body except at the very top of the head, right here. This is so important. Please try to understand how important this is. I cannot emphasize it enough. Make arrangements for yourself, make arrangements for your loved ones. Write it down so that nobody screws it up. This is important. And here's the reason why. Just as it is possible for each of us to go to any of those 6 realms of cyclic existence during the Bardo of Becoming, there is also an apparent method or exit point by which we go into those 6 realms. For the lowest hell realms, it is through the anus. That is literally how we go into those lowest realms. Through the secondary low realms, it is through the genital channels. The consciousness will actually leave the body through those channels, and that will absolutely write in stone and dictate the next experiences. One can leave through the nostrils, one can leave through the mouth, one can leave through the ears, one can leave in many different ways. But the way to leave in order to achieve rebirth in the Pure Land is to leave correctly through the central channel out the top of the head. And we will get into how to do that. We will teach you how to do that, and we will prepare you for that so that the channel is nice and clean and it's easy to get out. If you are a practitioner, if it's possible, it's best to be sitting up in the meditative posture, propped up with pillows, if you can't quite manage it. It's best to be in that position because it is the best position for a peaceful mind. It's absolutely the best position for a peaceful mind. If a person around you makes the mistake of touching the wrong part of your body when you're in that highly suggestive and fluid state, the person dying may leave through the wrong exit, literally. Even just that little condition can be very troublesome. And so, do not draw the person's attention to any place else other than the very top of their head right there. In fact, if you can, as the person's outer breath ceases and their inner breath is still going, you may take a little bit of the hair right there and tug. Internally, the person's attention will go up that way and their consciousness will follow. Even if they've done no practice, it will help. Or you can rub like this, or you can tap like that. But you, again, set it up so that someone will help you with this when the time comes. Or so that you can help others when the time comes. So that point is a very important point. And what are the things that are happening to us? We'll have to run a little bit later. I'm sorry about that. But I really need to get all of this out. We have too much to do this week. Now, but this is fascinating stuff. You'll be interested in this. After the outer breath has ceased, and the inner winds are beginning to die down and are now in the process of cessation, these are the inner images that will be experienced by all of us. However, how we experience them may vary, but if you learn to recognize them in this form, you will recognize them in any form that is particularly your characteristic form of perception. Okay? So there will be variations in your own individual experience, but again, practicing and hearing this teaching, you will understand and you will get the lay of the land and you will be ready. Now, at the time of death, first of all, let me backtrack. In the Bardo of Living, as we enter into life, we receive two seeds. We receive our father's seed and our mother's seed. And those seeds go to make us up. They join together and they make us up. In our physical body, let me see how it's put here. Well, here he calls it the masculine principle. So we'll use that. The father principle or the masculine principle actually resides in the top of our heads. That's where the mystical element of your father's seed, what was given to you, what is the masculine component of your nature, resides as a white tigle or luminescent circle, if you have to think of it in a physical way, although it's not physical, you see. But a white tigle on top of the head that is firmly brought to you and is brought to you by the union of the seed between your father and your mother. The mother's seed resides at the base of the spine as a red tigle, and that is the feminine principle within you. No matter what sex you are or what your inclinations are or anything, you all have that. It's universal. We all have these principles, these feminine and masculine principles within us. At the moment of death, after the outer breath has stopped, when the inner winds are still somewhat moving, it hasn't totally stopped yet, first, the white tigle, or the father principle, the masculine principle, will disengage. It will no longer be held, bound, as it was during life, by the physical proximity or the physical area right here. It will not be bound by that. It will disengage, and it will simply disengage and fall, and it falls through the central channel to the heart, and there it remains. During the experience of death, what you will experience when that happens is extraordinary white luminosity, white light. If you have been trained to perceive that light through generation stage practice or even through Phowa, you will perceive that light in a welcoming way. You will see that light and know that that light is the very display of all the dakas, or the male Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. So you'll recognize that light and you will be like this, very devoted, very moving toward that light. If there has been no preparation for death, if you are not prepared for death, that light will be terrifying. It is extraordinarily bright and it seems to be unbearable because we are so closely connected to physical reality still that light by comparison is brighter than thousands of suns. It's too much. It seems too much, and it terrifies us if we are untrained. But if we have prepared in meditation, through either Phowa or through generation stage practice, we may be able to recognize that white light as being the very display of the male Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, or the male element, or the male, what is that word? Principle of the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas. Now, if you don't make it at that time, if you don't recognize the white light and go toward it in your practice and become one with it, you will continue in the Bardo experience. If you do recognize that white light and recognize it as the nature of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and with devotion go forth toward the light, then you may actually exit the Bardo experience without having to go through the rest of the Bardo, and either be reborn in a pure land in order to receive instruction, or be reborn as a Nirmanakaya form. There are many different ways that one can be born, but there is actually a traditional, well, I'll get to that later on. Let me finish with the lights first. There's actually a traditional way to view how that birth will take place. Now, the next thing that happens if we are continuing through the Bardo is that the female Bindu, or Tigle, disengages from the base of the spine, and that is the mother seed. The mother seed then rises up to the heart. And when that happens, we will see red luminosity. Now, literally, we have never seen red luminosity before. We don't know what it is, complicated by the fact that it's like no red we've ever seen before, and no luminosity we've ever seen before. It's extraordinarily brilliant, extraordinarily profound, and it is the kind of experience where you don't just see the light out there. It affects one totally. And so there may become like a fear of that. And generally speaking, practitioners run from the red light. The red light is actually the appearance of the female Buddhas, or the Dakinis. And it is the true essential nature that was your mother's nature, without the level of delusion that your mother carried, her true nature, her Buddha nature. And that is the truth of that. You will see this red light, and in most cases, sentient beings will run away from that red light. They will not know what it is. It will confuse them. And at that time also, there is an impact also of sound and feeling as well. You can't explain that, but try to imagine light that registers so strongly that it registers on every sense you've ever experienced. So there is a feeling and a hearing and every kind of component to it as well. It's just too much for the unprepared. Now, when the white and the red light come together in the heart, they meet. And at that time, an extraordinary thing happens. All the elements have dissolved. The male and female Buddha principles have united within your mind, and you have none, temporarily, of any of the attachments and hang-ups and clinging associated with physical life. All of the elements have dissolved. There is a moment of spaciousness at that time, such as what you have never experienced before and cannot experience at any other moment. This moment is so precious, so precious. Because when the male and female principle unite within the heart, at that moment, one sees clearly the Dharmata, the true face of one's own nature, as being separate and indistinguishable. All phenomena is seen at that time to have the same taste. One cannot make a distinction, literally cannot make a distinction between subjective and objective. All of the components of deluded mind are temporarily disengaged at that period of time. And there is at that moment the most extraordinary potential for liberation. But the Dharmata, our true nature, has no visible light, because what would be that is lit? Our nature is not that which can be described, let alone colored or lit. What would be that thing that is lit? So our perception, when these two elements come together, is an experience of black luminosity for the non-practitioner. And this black luminosity affects the non-practitioner as a fainting or a sleep. And this is the time during the death process where the sentient being actually goes under, goes dead in their minds. They actually experience death. For the practitioner, that dark luminosity, if we are prepared and if we have experienced meditation successfully, even for a moment, can be perceived as clear luminosity. Now remember, the condition of our mind affects us. If we are fearful, if we are running in the Bardo state, it will be dark luminosity, and it will frighten us, and it will be tremendously impactful. But if we are prepared and our minds have been changed through meditation, then it will be a clear luminosity, and the recognition of one's own mind, of one's own supreme Buddha nature, will be very much like a mother and a child who have been separated. Suddenly the child sees her mother, and she runs to her mother, and there's no denying her mother. The smell, the touch, the view of her mother is like, there is no one else. I could not deny that this is my mother. This is my long-lost mother. And the child literally, this is the practitioner, of course, jumps into the mother's lap and drinks the milk from the mother's breast. And that is what happens if one is prepared for death. When that moment occurs, we jump through pure view into the arms of the Dharmata, and we drink the nectar of our Buddhahood. And that is a happy and profound and joyful moment for that one who is prepared for death. Unfortunately, however, and this is where we're going to close so that you have something to think about tonight, for those who are unprepared for death, this is the moment that they miss utterly. It is never known. This precious moment where we come face to face freely and inexpensively, with our own, and we sleep through it. We literally sleep through it. And it's because we cannot recognize. It is like a person who is suddenly without eyes. They see blackness, and not knowing that this is their life without eyes, they think it is time to sleep. They instinctively go towards sleep. If the person recognizes this nature, that liberation that occurs at the moment of the union of the mother principle and the father principle, that occurs when these two principles have united, is supreme realization. Very difficult to do, but the result is supreme. In that, one can return in a form to benefit sentient beings, having accomplished the pure view of recognizing one's own Buddha nature. One literally abides spontaneously in the mind of the Buddhas. One literally is awake. Having remained awake in that time, one has created the potential and the connection with the awakeness of one's own nature. And so, this extraordinary moment, this extraordinary benefit, for most of us is completely unrecognized. Because we have no experience with meditation, we cannot recognize our mother, our nature. We cannot recognize the Dharmata. We have no experience with it. It is like a child who was taken out from the mother's womb, never having seen the mother's face, and was kept separately, raised separately from the mother. That child would not recognize its mother and would not drink from its mother's breast. So this is the experience that we are fighting for in our practice for Phowa. We are fighting to recognize those moments and to prepare ourselves for something that, while frightening to ordinary sentient beings, for the practitioner can be an extremely joyful, happy, and productive moment. A moment that we would aspire to and would wish for if we had that power any other way. A moment that we aspire to and wish for in our practice Don't you wish in your meditation that your mother nature, your true nature, would simply come up and show its face to you? Of course you wish that. And yet here, at the moment of death, this happens and will happen to each and every one of us without exception. What we are trying to do during this week is to make it possible for us to recognize, in order to accept the blessing of what is to happen to us naturally. So, being as though it is 5 o'clock, that's where we have to stop today. No.